Imagine you are a banker living in England in early 2011, walking into your local Aston Martin dealer looking for something to blow your enormous bonus on. You step inside, dreaming of looking like Daniel Craig, and see TB9s, DBSs, Vantages, and even Rapides. You're surrounded by sexy and powerful cars. Then all of a sudden, you're greeted with this. Confusion sets in as the salesman walks up to you and starts talking. This is the Cygnet, our new city car. Cygnet is small but luxurious, an Aston Martin tailor fit for the city. Remember, as you stand there contemplating the absurdity of what's in front of you, a vague memory of reading an article about some new EU regulations pops up in your mind, and you realize why this thing exists. I've got no interest in compliance cars. The word compliance makes you think about obeying rules or regulations, especially when it comes to the government. Compliance cars are no different. They are, in the simplest terms, vehicles created by manufacturers not because they think they will sell well, generate profits, or because they want to, but because they have to meet a certain law or regulation. They need to be compliant. This usually requires achieving some sort of fleet emission standard or something specific like selling a zero-emission vehicle. Manufacturers, of course, do not like being told what to do by the government, and so create compliance cars in response. These are almost all created by either taking an existing model already on sale and modifying it, or by rebadging someone else's car. There are a number of ways that compliance cars can be identified. These are limited production, availability only through leasing or controlled sales, only being available in certain markets, little to no advertising, for electric cars a limited range, and finally, little interest in creating a viable product that the public actually wants to buy. Some cars meet more of these criteria than others, but all meet enough to warrant their classification. Almost no manufacturers would admit to creating these cars for this expressed purpose, the exception being Fiat, because they don't want the negative association. The identifiers are therefore very useful in recognizing what is and isn't a compliance car. There have been a number of interesting examples throughout history of both the gas and electric variety, and here are some of them, beginning with electric. One of the earliest examples is the GM EV1. First introduced for model year 1997, it is different from others in that it wasn't an existing model. Instead, it was created by evolving an older electric car concept GM had created. One would think this might disqualify it from the compliance label, but unfortunately not. Its history shows why that was never going to be true. In 1990, the California Air Resources Board mandated that the seventh largest automakers in the US have at least 2% of their fleet be zero emission by 1998. It was this mandate that led to the concept car evolving into the EV1 and also provides context for how it was treated. General Motors was very open that they did not want to build this car and did not consider it viable. They went on to only build 1,117 units across 2 generations. You could only get them via lease, it was only available to select markets in California, Arizona, and Georgia. GM did advertise the EV1 a little bit, including a showing at the premiere of the movie Daylight, but it was undoubtedly a compliance car. When regulations were relaxed, GM was quick to kill off the program in 2003 and crush all the cars not donated to museums, much to the anger of the owners. The introduction of much more stringent California regulations in 2012 required the 6 manufacturers that sold the most cars in the state all sell a zero-emissions vehicle. Unsurprisingly, a raft of compliance cars soon followed. I think 2 of them in particular are good showcases. The first is the original Fiat 500e, which I think is the most blatant compliance car ever. The CEO of Fiat Chrysler, Sergio Marchionne, said, "I hope you don't buy it," and that Fiat lost $14,000 on each one. He went on to say that he only wanted to sell the absolute minimum necessary to meet regulations, and that Fiat would not invest in electric cars beyond compliance standards. To say the Italians had little interest in creating a viable product would be a massive understatement. They loathed the whole project. The car itself was created by simply throwing some batteries and an electric motor into a Fiat 500 and calling it a day. It is not surprising that it was produced in low numbers, was only available in California and Oregon, and was never sold in Europe. To cap it off was the pitiful range of 87 miles, which, for context, was worse than what GM had half-heartedly managed over a decade earlier. To show their confidence and interest in it, Fiat even started offering $50 a month leases. Two words sum up this car more than any other: malicious compliance. The second example that I think is worth talking about is the Ford Focus Electric. Based surprisingly on the existing Ford Focus, it had some things that made it a bit better than some of its contemporaries. One of these was that after an initial limitation on availability, Ford eventually made the decision to sell it in all 50 states and Europe. It also had the furthest range of the compliance cars sold at the time, albeit only after 2017 and only managing to hit 115 miles. While this all sounds encouraging, it was still clearly a compliance car. Ford sold a low number of them, advertising was non-existent, and at the end of the day, like the Fiat, it was just a gas-powered car hastily modified to be electric. Dearborn might have been less malicious in its compliance compared to the Italians, but they were playing the exact same game. Now, it might be easy to say, well, if all of these big companies were doing it, then it must not have been possible to create a good electric product. But that's not true. At the same time as the 500e and the Focus were around, you could buy a Nissan Leaf or a Tesla Model S, which proved that it was entirely possible to create a good electric car product. Just that some manufacturers didn't put the time and money and effort into creating theirs. While most compliance cars are just cynical, half-baked products created only to meet regulations, that doesn't mean they can't be funny. Enter the one you've probably been waiting for me to talk about, the Aston Martin Cygnet. I mean, just look at it. It looks like if someone took a DB9 and squashed it from both ends. The question, of course, is, why was it created in the first place? Well, Aston Martin in the early 2010s was in a bind, as looming EU regulations about fleet emissions threatened them in a big way. They only made big, heavy, thirsty cars. Unlike many small volume manufacturers producing similarly environmentally unfriendly cars, the Brits had no corporate owners. This meant that while a brand like Lamborghini had Volkswagen to bail them out, Aston Martin was on their own. So what were they to do? Create a more fuel-efficient vehicle? Of course not. Why do all the hard work to create a car when you can just as easily use someone else's? So they went over to Toyota and asked if they could license their city car, the IQ. Toyota said yes, and the Cygnet was born. While there's nothing wrong with the IQ, as it was a really clever city car, the Cygnet was a different story. Aston now had a car that got over 50 miles to the gallon, but was also about as far away from their usual products as you could get. So what did they do to make it a true Aston Martin, worthy of the name? Well, they gave it a version of the iconic grille, some fake hood vents, fake side vents, and a new interior with a little bit of leather. And that was it. The IQ, being a Toyota, commanded a price of around 10,000 British pounds when new. The Cygnet cost 30,000. Let me say that again, 30,000 pounds. 3 times the price of the IQ, and you were paying a whole lot for that badge. Aston genuinely expected to sell about 4,000 of these a year, and that number really makes sense if you don't live in this plane of existence. They initially only marketed the Cygnet in the UK and only to existing customers, with sales expanding to Europe after a year. This would turn out to be very optimistic. To say that it flopped would be an understatement. It's like a kid jumping off a 30-foot diving board belly first. They managed to sell less than 850 in 2 years before pulling the plug, making it the second shortest production run of any Aston Martin ever. They really got it into their heads that this would get them out of their emissions hole. Now you might think that the silliness ended with the standard Cygnet, The Aston Martin charging people £30,000 for the privilege of buying a restyled Toyota IQ was as ridiculous as it got. Enter the Aston Martin Cygnet and Colette. What's a Colette, you might ask? Well, Colette was a French luxury fashion store in Paris. And yes, Colette here is lowercase. So what? Aston partnered with a trendy fashion store to make a special edition. What's so silly about that? Well, it cost £40,000. And back in 2011, that was about the same as 70,000 US dollars. So what did you get for your extra £10,000? Well, you got blue lipstick around the grille, they made the mirrors blue, they gave you a blue stripe and blue wheels. Oh, and they also added "and Colette" to the boot badge. And if the exterior changes didn't quite make it worth your while, the interior changes did not disappoint. You got special door handles, hexagon quilted sun visors, blue leather throw pillows for the rear seats, and a Colette branded GPS system. Then, to top it all off, you got a number of items from the Colette store, including a camera, custom candy, Air Aroma Colette fragrance spray, a wallpaper Paris city guide, and 4 Colette compilation CDs. Leave it to Aston Martin to find a way to sell a rebadged compliance car for the cost of a new Cayman S. It's easy to think that this is a thing of the past, and that nowadays, with everyone downsizing engines and creating all sorts of electric offerings, that compliance cars aren't a thing anymore. However, they are very much still around. In 2022, Motor One reported on an anonymous Stellantis source describing the Dodge Hornet as Dodge took advantage of the tonale to make a compliance car. Their Aston Martin Cygnet moment, if you will. Suffice it to say, internal politics won the day, and Dodge needed to up their cafe numbers, so Hornet was born. So next time you see a Dodge Hornet on the road, remember it exists for cafe standards. At the end of the day, compliance cars exist and will continue to exist because when the government creates a mandate or a regulation, many manufacturers will choose the quick and dirty solution to the problem rather than putting in the work to create a real product the public will actually want to buy.